Just as important as anything else in wrestling is storytelling. After all, it's this which often gets us invested in the build to a big match. But what happens when a story starts and then never gets a chance to finish, or even worse, never gets a chance to make it to screen at all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the time Dolph Ziggler quit WWE in 2017, only to then return with no real explanation. What was the idea behind this one? Well, we think it was an attempt to create a worked shoot kind of situation, as toward the end of that year, the show-off decided he agreed with fans who felt he'd been underutilized for far too long. And so it was then that after winning the United States title from Baron Corbin at Clash of Champions in December, Dolph would come out to the ring on the very next episode of SmackDown and lay the title down on the ground as a sign he was vacating it. Why was he doing this? Well, as he explained then, the company no longer deserved him, and instead he was quitting to go try his luck elsewhere. Obviously then, this left a bunch of possibilities open, possibilities which could have included the Ohio native showing up at indie promotions like Ring of Honor and doing his own Summer of Punk style story where he proved that he was still the real US champion in spirit. But if that was the plan, this plan never made it to screen. Now, as it turned out, all that would end up happening would be Ziggler disappearing for a few weeks, then returning at the Royal Rumble, all to absolutely zero fanfare. And we mean zero fanfare here because he'd be quickly eliminated from the bout and immediately slotted back into the same mid-card spot he'd been in before. Really then, it left everyone to wonder what the point of the whole thing had been. Had there been a bigger plan on the table for this at one point, a plan which was ultimately cancelled? Well, while we don't know for certain, it's safe to assume there was once more to this story than what we got. And because whatever that more was ended up getting scrapped, it just further solidified the idea that Dolph was never going to get his full due in WWE. Come on now, if there was ever a time to try and make a last gasp attempt to turn the show off into a breakout star, this would have been it. It would have certainly gotten interest from fans, but in the end it just didn't play out that way, and the former Mr. Money in the Bank isn't the only WWE act who had a potential big push hobbled at the knees as a result of an aborted storyline. Now, if we go back to late 2010, then we'll find a similar situation playing itself out with the Nexus and their feud with The Undertaker, which never came to pass. Of course, by the time late 2010 came around, the Nexus were already in dire straits. After all, following their fantastic introduction that summer where they invaded Raw NWO style and tore up the whole ringside area, things quickly fell apart when the group of NXT graduates found themselves settling into the role of cannon fodder for John Cena. But there was one thing which could have revived them here, and it was something which very nearly happened as, at that year's Survivor Series, the collective of heels would interfere during a Buried Alive match between The Undertaker and Kane to help the Big Red Machine get the win. Why had they done this? Well, when asked after the fact, Wade Barrett wouldn't fully explain, though he would allude to the fact that there was more info to come. And this lined up with early dirt sheet reports which suggested that the Englishman was going to be the Phenom's challenger at the then upcoming WrestleMania 27, and possibly even the man to finally break his undefeated streak. But this never ended up happening in the end, and by the time the Dead Man returned, no further reference would be made to the fact that the Nexus had screwed him over during his last appearance. Now, whatever the plan had been here, it had clearly now been dropped cold. And this left us all to wonder what the story was supposed to be and why it had been so abruptly dropped. Had Vince McMahon just decided that the Nexus were too much of a case of damaged goods to waste on an Undertaker WrestleMania feud? Or was it maybe a case of Mark Calloway himself wanting to work with someone else at the Showcase of the Immortals? Someone like the person he eventually wrestled at that show, Triple H. We'll probably never know the full details at this point, as anyone who does have the scoop doesn't seem to be talking. All we're left to wonder now is how much this could have changed the career of Wade Barrett, as, even if he'd failed in his attempts to end the streak, just being put in that spot would have surely elevated him to another level on the card, one which might have seen him be presented as a full-blown main eventer going forward. But at least the Englishman can rest safe in the knowledge that he's not the only person who had a notable WrestleMania feud pulled away from him because of changed plans, as if we flash forward a little bit to 2016, we'll find another example of an act storyline for that show in the form of Bray Wyatt versus Brock Lesnar. Now, in the mid-2010s, there weren't a lot of true big-time first matches left in WWE, as most everyone had wrestled everyone else at some point. But that didn't mean there weren't a few which were still being kept in the back pocket here. And one of the biggest of these was a potential showdown between Bray Wyatt and Brock Lesnar. So when heading into WrestleMania 32, this looked to be what we were getting. It got fans very excited indeed. Sure, it might have been a clash of styles on paper, the more spooky theatrics of the Eater of Worlds and the more shoot-style brutality of the Beast, but that only made the whole thing more enticing. And when Brock found himself getting eliminated from the Royal Rumble by the entire Wyatt family in January, it seemed like it was a lock that this one was happening. But then something changed over the weeks which followed, and by the time we got to the big show, Lesnar was instead fighting Dean Ambrose, and Bray Wyatt was relegated to a mid-show segment with The Rock. So, what happened? Well, again, this is one where the details are not fully known, though it has been speculated that Brock simply didn't want to work with Bray as he thought their styles wouldn't go well together. Hell, this would explain why the whole thing was dropped so abruptly enough that there was no more time to book another program for Wyatt for WrestleMania. But then it may not have been the Beast who was responsible here, though it may have actually been Jon Moxley instead. That's right, back in early 2016, when he was still going by the name of Dean Ambrose, the Lunatic Fringe managed to get pretty over in a short space of time, over enough that at one point there were even calls to put the WWE title on him in the lead up to the Showcase of the Immortals. But instead of doing this, Vince McMahon decided to give him a big Mania match instead, one against Lesnar. Sadly though, that match would end up being a disappointment, mostly as by that point Brock had already decided he was going back to UFC and so didn't want to do anything too physical. And this meant everyone involved ended up suffering, the fans included. Of course, this is far from the only time Dean Ambrose found himself involved in a cancelled storyline while he was with WWE though. No, if we go back a few years to 2012, we'll find an even earlier example of this in his aborted program with Mick Foley. Okay, this one takes us back to a time before Dean Ambrose had ever even made it to the WWE main roster. Hell, back then, while he was still technically under WWE contract, he hadn't appeared on any of their shows and was still known to the world as Jon Moxley, the psychotic deathmatch wrestler of promotions like CZW. Obviously then, there was a lot of talk within the booking team about what would be the best way to debut the Cincinnati native, and one of the early ideas that was put out there was for him to be introduced in a brutal hardcore feud with the hardcore legend himself, Mick Foley. So far would this one get, in fact, Mox would even begin throwing insults at Foley on social media as a means of getting the ball rolling on the eventual match. Unfortunately though, that was where the feud ultimately ended. Yes, this one would never make it to the ring, and instead John would debut later that winter as one-third of the Shield. And the reasons that happened are twofold. Firstly, there were rumors that Mick felt Moxley went a little too far with some of the things he said about him, and this led to there being some heat there for a while. More importantly though, this was 2012, and by that point, after years of destroying his body with one of the most punishing styles any wrestler has ever endured, Mrs. Foley's baby boy was a shell of the man he'd been before. Yes, by this point, Mick was allegedly getting concussed doing simple things like back bumps. Obviously then, that was very concerning, and it led to doctors refusing to clear him for any kind of in-ring competition. Would we have loved to see a feud between Mick Foley and that pre-Shield version of Jon Moxley? Sure. We can only imagine the craziness they might have come up with together and the violent scenes they would have created. But at least, in lieu of this happening, we got the Shield. So it's not like fans lost out or anything. And it's not like fans lost out on much with our next entry either, as it happens, because that one would have seen CM Punk, right at the height of the summer of Punk in 2011, spend months feuding with Kevin Nash. Okay, a lot of you probably remember this one. After all, this was the point where WWE felt more exciting than it had in years, and the reason for that was because following his pipe bomb promo, CM Punk had managed to capture the attention of wrestling fans everywhere. Really, everything up to and including his WWE title win at Money in the Bank 2011 was executed perfectly. It was just the stuff which came after which took all the wind out of the sails. That said, for as much as Punk dropping the belt to Alberto Del Rio, then doing a job to Triple H hurt his momentum, it could have been much worse, as if the original plan had played itself out, it would have involved him feuding with Big Sexy himself instead. Why was that the plan? Well, it's hard to say, but it was very clearly in the works at one point, as it would be at SummerSlam that Nash appeared to jackknife powerbomb the Second City Saint and screw him out of the gold. And after a few weeks of Punk claiming it was Triple H who'd put him up to this, in the end we'd get the reveal that Nash texted himself to show up at that event and take out the champ. Thankfully though, this was as far as things went, because before the pair could get in the ring at Night of Champions, the founding member of the NWO would have to undergo a physical. And over the course of this physical, WWE doctors determined that his body was too wrecked for him to be cleared to get in the ring. So it was then that in a hasty last-minute move, Nash was out and Triple H was in instead, with this being the last time that Big Daddy Cool would play any role in the entire angle. Yeah, sometimes a storyline getting canceled really can work out for the better, but more often than not, it works out for the worse as fans miss out on something they would have surely enjoyed seeing. And if you need another example of this being the case, you need only look toward our next entry, the time John Cena almost turned heel on The Rock in the lead up to WrestleMania 28. Oh, what could have been with this one? Let us take you back if we can. It's the beginning of a new decade. A large section of the fan base have long since grown tired of John Cena in the role of top dog of WWE, and a new anti-hero has arisen for this group of people in CM Punk. How fortuitous was it then that in the lead up to Big Match John's WrestleMania 28 match with The Rock, the match that was billed at this point as being once in a lifetime, there were at least initial plans being made to turn Cena heel. How would this have worked out? Well, at some point prior to that event, John would have shown us all his dark side. And from this moment onwards, he would have changed up his ring gear and his entrance music, all while adopting a more aggressive demeanor in the ring. It could have been exactly what WWE needed to freshen itself up in 2011, and it would have allowed CM Punk to rise to the level of top babyface. But in the end, the Cena heel turn would never play out on screen. So rather than getting a fresh coat of paint for the promotion here, the status quo would largely remain, and it wouldn't be until 2025 that the mythical Cena heel turn happened. Was this a missed opportunity? Sure, but it's not like face versus face Cena Rock didn't do big business in the spring of 2012 anyway. And it's not like CM Punk didn't become a big star regardless, even if he could have been way bigger. Ultimately then, this is a cancelled storyline that, while it would have been nice to see, didn't change much at the end of the day. Can the same be said about our next subject, however? Well, let's find out right now as we look at the axed feud between Steve Austin and Dr. Death Steve Williams. Okay, a little bit of backstory here for those who don't know already. Back during the mid to late 90s, Dr. Death Steve Williams was considered one of the toughest men in all of wrestling, with this being a reputation he largely gained during his time in All Japan Pro Wrestling, right at the peak of their popularity. So when he was brought into WWF in 1998, then it felt like a given he would get a monster heel push at some point, something which would have seen him inevitably clash with then top babyface Stone Cold Steve Austin. And that was the original plan as it happened. Yes, the whole idea behind the infamous Brawl for All would be that, because this was a tournament in which roster members engaged in shoot fights, Williams would have no problem mowing through the competition on account of how legitimate of a brawler he was. But then the competition started, and amongst the many things which went wrong during it, the most damaging was arguably the fact that Bart Gunn beat Dr. Death in the second round. As you would expect then, this instantly killed the Colorado native's credibility as a tough guy, and that meant any plans to have a feud between him and Steve Austin over the WWF title were scrapped. What a shame this was then, because we've no doubt that feud would have been awesome. Sadly though, because he was put in a shoot fight ahead of time, and because he lost this fight, Williams never got this run in the main event scene. Rather, he'd be relegated to the lower mid-card instead for the rest of his time with the company, all the way up until he finally left in 1999. But let's move away from tough guy brawlers for now, and over to Jackass stuntmen instead, as that's the focus of our next act's storyline, the time the crew of Jackass almost feuded with Team WWE in 2007. Okay, this is another one which will require a little bit of explanation. Basically, back in October of 2006, as part of a press tour to promote the release of their newest movie, Jackass Number 2, Steve-O and Chris Pontius appeared on an episode of Raw. And during this episode, they'd be subject to a beatdown from the big monster heel of the time, Umaga. Where was this supposed to lead? Well, if the stories which were circulating around at the time are to be believed, the original plan was for all this to lead to the entire Jackass crew returning to feud with WWE, with the whole thing then climaxing in a big multi-man match at SummerSlam in 2007. Obviously though, that didn't end up happening, and the reasons for this are varied. First of all, it was alleged that Steve-O found himself getting heat with the WWE office, as after he got laid out by Umaga, rather than sell it like a savage beating, he could be seen laughing with joy in the middle of the ring. Then of course, there was the fact that by the time the summer of 2007 was approaching, Jackass Number 2 was gone from theaters, and so there wasn't as much demand for a big crossover event. Perhaps most of all though, by summer of 2007, a combination of scheduling conflicts on the Jackass crew's side and hesitancy from WWE to actually put these guys in the ring for a match made the whole thing just not feel worth it anymore. Sometimes, though, a storyline being scrapped hasn't got anything to do with scheduling conflicts or hesitancy to put untrained workers in the ring. No, sometimes it happens when one key person involved gets fired, as was the case with the planned 1992 feud between The Undertaker and Nails. Now, The Undertaker had a lot of wacky opponents back during the early to mid-90s. Seriously, back then he was pretty much known for being the guy who was constantly drawing the short straw during feuds against people such as Giant Gonzalez, The Executioner, and Mabel. But at least there was one he managed to avoid, and this was the program which would have seen him lock horns with Nails. Who was Nails? Well, he was someone who'd been brought into WWE earlier that year as a rival for the Big Boss Man. Basically, the idea here was that he was an ex-con who felt he'd been wrongfully incarcerated by Ray Traylor, and so once he'd escaped from prison, he'd come looking for his revenge. That said, for as much as this made him a tailor-made opponent for the Boss Man, it didn't really give him any other obvious people to work with in WWF once that feud was done. Enter The Undertaker, the man who could try to make something out of just about anything back then. He was given the task here of feuding with Nails next, but before this program would ever make it to screen, the whole thing would be cancelled when the heel found himself getting fired from the company. What has he done to get himself fired? Well, apparently after being unhappy with his payoff for his big match with the Boss Man, Kevin Washoles went into Vince McMahon's office to confront him about it, with this leading to him attempting to choke the boss out right there at his desk. Needless to say then, after Nails was pulled off of McMahon, he'd be fired on the spot and would from this point onwards never be welcomed at a WWE show again. So any ideas fans have had of what it would look like when the zombie mortician locked horns with the ex-convict would have to remain a part of their imagination. And that isn't the only example of a storyline from early 90s WWF which was cancelled abruptly when one party got themselves fired. No, there must have been something in the water back during the tail end of the Golden Era, as we could find a very similar example in our next entry, the planned feud between the Ultimate Warrior and Jake the Snake Roberts. Now, some of you will no doubt remember this one. After all, it was the moment that kicked off Jake's great early 90s heel turn as, after weeks of supposedly trying to psych up the Warrior and prepare him for a big match with The Undertaker, Roberts proved that he was a snake after all when he betrayed his trainee. As you would expect then, the initial plan was for this to lead to a major feud between the pair, a feud which would have been big enough to headline a WrestleMania if it was booked correctly. So why didn't it happen then? Well, as we mentioned a moment ago, one party would end up getting fired before things could proceed. And to the surprise of no one, that party was Jim Hellwig. That's right, this was the first of 3 times the Warrior would be fired by WWE, with this example centering around the infamous pay dispute he and Vince McMahon had at SummerSlam 91. As far as Hellwig was concerned, the extra money he'd asked for had been agreed 2 weeks prior to the show, and as far as the boss was concerned, that didn't matter as he felt he'd been strong-armed into doing this in the first place, so for that reason, he didn't need to honor the existing agreement. Of course, the people who suffered the most out of this were the fans, as they were robbed of seeing what would have no doubt been a big-time feud. But at least there was a silver lining, because as a backup option, we would get the absolutely stellar program between Jake Roberts and Randy Savage. You know the one. It's the feud which gave us the famous scene of Jake having his Cobra bite the Macho Man on the arm in the middle of the ring. So in a way, things worked out better than they would have otherwise. But let's move away from WWE for now, as they're not the only company who have had canceled storylines over the years. Now, if we head over to WCW for a while, we'll find another prime example of this happening in the aborted tale of the Nasty Boys versus the NWO. Now, for this one, we have to go forward a little bit to the mid-90s. That was when the NWO had just changed the landscape of North American wrestling forever. And using the momentum they'd created after their formation, they were in the midst of consuming the entirety of World Championship Wrestling. That said, there were people who fought back against this, people who remained loyal to the company which had been born out of the ashes of Jim Crockett Promotions, even as the New World Order continued to gain more and more members by the week. If Brian Knobbs and Jerry Saggs had their way though, they'd be doing their bit to hobble those who were fighting back. Yes, as it happened, one of the early plans for the NWO angle was for the Nasty Boys to be one of the major acts involved in it, with this likely playing off the fact that both were known to be close friends with Hulk Hogan in real life. Obviously then, it's easy to imagine a story beat here where they agreed with their buddy's new turn to the dark side and wanted to get in on the action themselves. In the end, however, none of this ever got past the drawing board stage, with the reason for that apparently being because Hogan just didn't think it was a good idea. And with him having so much creative control at this time, that was enough to axe the entire thing right there and then. So because of this, while Knobbs and Sags would remain a part of WCW for a little while longer, they would increasingly be pushed to the margins of the promotion as the NWO took over and their roles on the show became all but non-existent. But sometimes it's not creative differences that cause a storyline to fall through before it can ever get carried out. No, sometimes an unfortunate passing is what causes this. And if you need a more modern example of this being the case, you only have to jump towards present-day WWE and look at our next entry, the unfinished saga of Bray Wyatt and Uncle Howdy. Yes, over the course of his career, Bray Wyatt had various different incarnations in WWE, with the first being his Bayou cult leader, an incarnation which ended up largely getting neutered by weak booking. But that didn't hold Wyndham Rotunda down for long, because after a while he'd simply reinvent himself as The Fiend, a horror movie-esque villain he's probably best remembered for today. Of course, this wasn't the last version of him we'd see in WWE though. Now, after he was fired back in 2021 and then brought back again in late 2022, he'd be reintroduced as a man who was now being haunted by a mysterious figure named Uncle Howdy. Clearly then, the idea was that there was some unknown connection between these two figures, a connection we would have no doubt seen play out as time went on. But before things could really get into second gear with the whole angle, Bray would be taken off TV amid rumors of health concerns. And when those health concerns were later confirmed to be real and the reason for his shocking passing in August of 2023 at just 36 years old, it meant the entire thing would remain unresolved forever. That's right, we'll now never know just how the Uncle storyline might have played out in its original incarnation, as the brains behind the entire thing is no longer here today. That said, at least it's been able to continue on in spirit as, in recent months, Bo Dallas, Bray's brother and the man who had originally played the role of Uncle Howdy, has come back to TV in order to form the Wyatt Six, a stable of him and 4 other performers in Eric Rowan, Dexter Lumis, Joe Gacy, and Nikki Cross, who have largely served as a tribute to Wyndham. And in doing so, they've been able to have some degree of success, even becoming SmackDown Tag Team Champions as of the time of this video's recording. Obviously then, this has to make Bray happy in spirit. Is this the same as seeing his original angle being completed? No. What we're getting now is clearly something very different. But at least it's a continuation of some sort, better than most other unfinished or abandoned storylines get. Hell, out of all the ones we've looked at today, this is really the only one which gave us any kind of closure at all. So for that, we're thankful. After all, when it comes to canceled angles in wrestling, you have to take what you can get, because you're sadly never going to get the whole thing once it's been removed from the storyboard.